The Churchville Schoolhouse opens the door to the best education in history. Visitors to the Churchville Schoolhouse take a step back in time to watch history unfold in a restored National Register of Historic Places property that dates to the Civil War era. Students of today walk in the footsteps of local farm children from the early days of DuPage County for an authentic living history experience led by a schoolmarm of the early 1900s. A visit to the Churchville Schoolhouse is hands-on, educational, and fun. Participants use slate chalkboards and McGuffey readers for the day's lessons. And children will be asked to follow proper classroom etiquette. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are practiced, and students test their skills during an old-fashioned spelling bee. And of course, no school day is complete without recess featuring games of the early 1900s. The schoolhouse is a popular place for scouts and day camps too. Group visits can also be arranged for service clubs, tour groups, and other adult organizations. The Churchville Schoolhouse Living History Program is operated by the Elmhurst Historical Museum. Call the museum today to book a field trip or find out more information. Call 630-833-1457 or visit our website at churchvilleschoolhouse.org. The Churchville Schoolhouse is waiting to open the doors for your school or community group. Plan a memorable learning experience today for the best education in history.
Welcome to the Churchville Schoolhouse and another edition of Elmhurst Time Travelers. I'm Ken Bartels, your host, and today we're talking about growing up in Elmhurst neighborhoods, and growing up in those neighborhoods. And to do that, we have three Elmhurstonians, John Quigley, Mary Ann Gorski, and Scott Algram, and welcome to Elmhurst Time Travelers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to start out by having all three of you sort of define the boundaries of your neighborhood. Where exactly is it that you're growing up? Mary Ann, you want to start?
I grew up in Crescent Park, which is bordered by St. Charles on the north to the Aurora and Elgin tracks on the south, which is now the Prairie Path, and Poplar, and now 290.
John?
459 Washington, a block and a half from the intersection of York and St. Charles.
And I was south side of Elmhurst. I was on Hillside, moved to Saylor, and then back to Spring and Villette. So all within just a couple of blocks my whole growing up time.
And the amount of time you were in that neighborhood?
At Hillside, I was born there, kindergarten and first grade with Miss Poltrock at Lincoln School, that I'm sure a lot of people know. Moved to Saylor and went to Jackson up through sixth grade, and then on to Bryan, and then York High School after that.
And I spent my whole growing up time in Crescent Park, going to Washington School. I was born on South Street, and then when I was in fifth grade, we moved around the corner to Fair, and I went to IC High School and grade school.
From birth into my early 20s on Washington, and then later on I had an apartment while I was working at Elmhurst College, right near the college, and right near Immaculate Conception Parish. And then I owned a home on the north end on Van Auken, right by Crestview Park.
Okay, so memory lane. The oldest memory you have of your growing up neighborhood. Mary Ann?
Oldest memory, and probably very unique, is I told you I grew up right near the tracks, and we were lucky enough to have a signal right in our garage perimeter, and the train needed to stop by that signal every time it passed through. So being some fun-loving kids that we were, we got to know the engineer very well, and we convinced him that he should let all of us into the train engine regularly. So we became very good friends with Mr. Stanley, and one time we even convinced him that not just the tour of the engine that we regularly had, we needed a tour of the caboose. So we all got out of the engine, and he needed to pull his train up however many feet or yards it was, so the caboose was at the signal. And then we got a tour of the caboose that day.
So a group of kids just got invited into the engine.
Regularly, yes.
And that same freight line ran at the end of my block, and on one side of the tracks, on the south side, was Hammersmith Lumberyard, and on the north side was People Coal and Gas. And the freight trains would come in at all hours, and they would unload sand, brick, stone, pavers, wood, lumber, everything you can imagine would get unloaded into the bays. And there were nights in the summer with the windows open, you just learned to sleep through the racket of the freight trains.
Well, my earliest memory wasn't quite as exciting as that, but I remember when I was probably 3 or 4 years old being able to walk down to the end of our block and wait for my grandparents who were coming to visit us. And at that time, it seemed like it was a mile-long walk, but it was about 3 or 4 houses. But as a little 3-year-old, that was pretty exciting to be able to walk and wait for them to come around the corner.
Now, quite accidentally, it's almost a west to east, right through the middle of Elmhurst, these 3 neighborhoods, from yours into the center, and then a little bit farther to the east. A lot of kids in your neighborhoods growing up?
Lots.
Huge. Lot of Irish and Italian Catholic families on the block. So if you had 7 kids, you were an average size family. And we had families with 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And if you had less than 4 kids, you were the Protestant family on the block.
Yes, a lot of kids. We didn't have any families with 10 kids, but we did have a lot of kids near us.
Yeah, we were the same way. It was just lots of kids and all ages. So you would, depending on where you were in your age group within your own family, those were the kids you played with in other families too. But there were always a few older than you and always a few younger than you wherever you went.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The quick movement to today, the perception of those neighborhoods today in terms of number of kids, you think there's as many kids in those your 3 neighborhoods today?
Fraction of the kids. Yeah. The families just aren't as big. And more than that, I don't think they interacted like they did when we were kids. It was not uncommon for 20, 30, 40, 50 kids to be out doing stuff on the block on any given day. And now I think people are more guarded about letting their kids out of the yard. They're more structured. They're going to this kind of activity than this kind of activity, where we were kind of left on our own. Yeah. Get out of the house and go do something.
Yeah, we're going to touch on that a little later as well. But same thing, I mean...
In general, yes. I feel in Crescent Park the families definitely weren't as large. Most families were 2 to 6 kids. And it's, I would say, 2 to 4 kids there now. And I agree with John. We definitely hung with kids pretty much exactly our age. But in my block, all those groups hung out together too. I mean, so we were hanging out with the littler kids and those guys in high school too.
Yeah, I noticed, especially at Halloween, is there don't seem to be the same number of kids coming around trick-or-treating as I remember when we were growing up, because there were just constant kids ringing the doorbell when we were growing up. Now, just doesn't seem to be that many kids in the neighborhood that are out doing that kind of thing, or just even out playing.
Sure. Did you have a best friend growing up?
I had a couple best friends, and as I went through getting older, those best friends would change a little bit. But it started out with the kid that lived right behind me, Steve Porter, and then Doug Akey, who we used to ride bikes up and down what became the Prairie Path. It was just a little dirt path back then. And then getting into high school, Jim Reed, who was in the band, and Sue Ernst, who was in the band too. So by the time we got to high school, all the band kids seemed to be hanging together, but those were probably the ones I remember the most.
What did you play?
I played cornet.
Okay.
With Mr. Reamer, who did not believe in trumpets. So.
John, you have a best friend?
Jimmy O'Grady, good Irish Catholic family.
I hope so.
All the girls in the family with good Colleen and all good Irish names. And my dad had died when I was 4 years old, and I looked at Jimmy O'Grady's dad as like the greatest father on the face of the earth. If I could have had a dad, I would have wanted Jimmy O'Grady's dad. He was just that jovial, great, active father that you'd want.
Mary Ann?
Definitely had one best friend from birth to kindergarten, and that was my friend Chris, who lived next door. And she was a year older than me, so we didn't have a lot of other options, and she was the greatest. But then she went to public school and I went to private school, and we remained friends for a while, but kind of drifted apart. But we're always close together.
I was gonna ask all three of you if you're still friends with, the last one on the list, or in your case, you still know where they are.
My IC class of 73 has been really good at getting together every 5 years, and Jimmy's come back for a couple of the reunions, and it's amazing. I might not see him for 10 years, and we sit down and the conversation just picks up immediately. And when we part, we go, hey, let's not have it be this long again.
Yeah.
But it's usually this long again.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, I still hear a lot about these guys, mainly from their parents. And that's how I kind of still be able to keep up a little bit with where they are and what their families are doing and where they live.
Yeah, and I'm in the same boat with Scott. Since I still live and work in Elmhurst, I see a lot of siblings or parents or even kids of my friends, and that's how I keep up with what's going on. I kind of get just tied up in my own life today and my kids' life, and some of those paths cross to my childhood, but in general, it's easy to keep in touch with people in Elmhurst because there's a lot of us here.
John touched on this a little bit, but in your neighborhoods, as you played either in small groups or John's gigantic 50-person mob, did you feel watched over? Did you feel like somebody was always keeping tabs of what you were doing and where you were, not necessarily your direct parental influence?
There wasn't a parent on the block who didn't have a problem saying, don't get out of line, I'll call your mother. And it was regular that we walked through backyards, not front yards. So you were regularly walking by a kitchen window or the TV room window, and you just wave in the back, hi. 10 kids walking through your backyard, and they didn't, get out of my backyard. They didn't do, it was, oh, hi, good kids. And so, like there were sidewalks out front, there were walking paths to get up and down the block through backyards, even if there were fences or hedges.
Yeah, and I agree with John. And some of the people on our block didn't even have kids. Mm-hmm. And those couples were just as happy to get to know the kids too. And we would walk in their houses too.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I remember too, is the backyards. Is you didn't go up and down the sidewalks. You went through the backyard. Mm-hmm. Every hedge had at least one spot where that was where you always went through, and all the yards connected through those hedges. Yep. And yeah, everybody kept an eye on everybody.
Yep.
Long before there were cell phones videoing everything.
Yeah.
You had everybody's moms.
Well, I know my answer to this, but I don't think it's that way now.
I don't think you can get from backyard to backyard. you know, a dog would get you, or an alarm would go off, or the homeowner would be screaming at you to get out of their backyard.
Yeah, and a lot of people keep their doors locked during the day too.
I remember too, not so many fences. You'd have some hedges, but not many fences. And you could play in the backyards, and you could play in multiple backyards at the same time because there weren't garages and fences.
Definitely.
And some of our favorite backyards, you backed up to one guy's garage, but then the next 3 yards were open and you could play wiffle ball back there because there was nothing to get in your way.
Well, I think we all understand the current phenomena of everything structured. You don't just get a pickup game going. You've got a uniform and a number and a coach and assigned practice times and what have you. But you just touched on the neighborhood memories of games or other kind of special things that went on. And I'm going to start with Mary Ann because she shared with me something earlier in the week. You know, you said something about a show.
And I did, because we would put on a Broadway production every summer. And there was a woman across the street who was our director, and she was just the coolest lady. So, and she had one daughter who was always the star, but that was okay. Nobody felt bad about that. And the one that I really remember was doing The King and I. And there were two girls that were Anna and the King, and all the little kids were just all those little kids in the play.
Whistling a happy tune.
Yes, and we had practice every day that I remember, and we would sing and dance, and then we would put this great production on in their backyard that was just for one night and just for our parents, or maybe a grandparent would come along, and that was pretty special.
That's pretty special. Did you invite the railroad engineer to stop by? I'm just curious.
You know what? I do remember talking about inviting him, but I guess he could not come across the street.
Yeah, I guess not. We probably couldn't stop that day.
Probably not.
We have to go to break. When I come back, the two of you get to answer that question about special events in your neighborhood, although I'm guessing you're not going to be able to top that one.
Not quite.
You're watching Elmhurst Time Travelers. We're talking about growing up in Elmhurst and 3 neighborhoods in specific. We'll be right back.
The Elmhurst Historical Museum, located in downtown Elmhurst, is proud to present award-winning exhibits for visitors of all ages. Our Adult Tea Time Talk series, family programs, and special events make learning about history interesting and fun. Admission is free, and on-site parking is available. Visit the Elmhurst Historical Museum soon. Call us today, or go to our website for the latest program details.
Welcome back to Elmhurst Time Travelers. We're talking with John Quigley, Mary Ann Gorski, and Scott Algram about growing up in Elmhurst, and there are 3 specific neighborhoods. And Mary Ann had just got done sharing a very unique thing about her neighborhood in terms of Broadway productions and local shows. And John, something unique about yours?
I think I can top her because
You've been thinking about it.
Little did I know that I would be running Elm Fest for years later. But when I was a kid, I was the block organizer, and I ran carnivals, usually once a month during the summer, so that a handful of us could get money that we could spend at the candy shop or at Al's Hobby Shop, in my case, where I spent most of my money as a youth. And we had all kinds of bucket games and golf games and jarts, if you can remember that. Imagine young kids throwing around jarts these days. You can't do that. The girl next door, Jessica Ertel, would bring out her Ouija board, and she'd do readings for the kids. And the parents would bring all their kids by, and it'd be a penny or a nickel, and we'd sell soda and do popcorn, and we'd do cotton candy. And I'd organize one every month throughout the summer to raise some cash.
I remember going to those.
Did you win anything? I hope not.
Not that I don't have it still.
That took out of my bottom line if they won.
Yeah, jarts, easy bake ovens, all these things that, I mean, I've told my kids that there's no way, given all the stuff I did, there's no way I should still be here. But Scott, your neighborhood.
We played games, sports games, and although I lived on Sailor, all the games always took place on Swain, and we would play in the street. We'd play football in the street, so of course we probably shouldn't be here for playing touch, tackle football in the street. We played hockey in the street, and as soon as it would snow, then it became hockey season because you could slide around in the street. In the summer we would play baseball or wiffle ball, and always in the street, and you could just do that. There weren't that many cars going up and down the street, but we didn't have organized events, but we would always there would be games playing in the street.
Yep.
Yeah, about now they're going to edit in the do not, these
Do
are
not do this at home.
professionals, don't do this on your own, between the train tracks and playing in the street and what have you. Other unique attributes of your neighborhoods that just sort of stick in your minds?
Well, one of the things that sticks in my mind was Crescent Park was the original neighborhood to put the outside Christmas trees in our
The classic yard tree thing.
Yeah, in the front yard, and we had one man that was the neighborhood organizer, and he went around a week before the pickup was, and the parents paid $4 per tree, and we would pick the trees up the first Saturday in December, and then by that night you had to have your tree in your front yard, and turn on time was like 5 o'clock, and we all had to have the same lights, which were the old-fashioned big color light bulbs. And Crescent Park was the only neighborhood that did that for years, and then everybody does it now.
I think Claremont Street was a street that became fairly well known
Yes.
for having holiday decorations, and so every year you'd either make sure your parents drove you by or you hopped on your bike to take a ride by and make sure all the lights were on there.
Yeah. I remember in our neighborhood was the bells. On the back door of houses that had kids, there was a bell, and it was a big bell that you could ring on the outside, and depending on whose mom needed what kid to come home, they would ring their bell, and you could tell the different bell sounds because they were all different sizes. And for our family, 1 ring meant my sister Sue, 2 rings was me, 3 rings was my brother, and 4 rings meant we all had to come home. And you could listen, and no matter where you were playing in the couple block neighborhood, you could hear these bells, and we would all know when it was time to go home.
Yeah. I've heard other people talk about that, and we didn't do that, but because the moms would just yell.
Did you have curfews?
When the street lights went on.
When the streetlights were on, okay?
I think usually it was when it was dark, was about the time.
Yeah, streetlight was a pretty common one. One, you had to be home for dinner, depending on whether or not you ate at 5, 6, or 7, depending on when Dad got home for most of the families. But then after that, if you could get out after dinner, then the streetlight was kind of the indicator.
Yep.
But you could stay out later provided you were gathered on somebody's front porch. So that if a parent walked out their front door,
Right.
they could glance down the block and see a group of kids at a house 8 houses down on the opposite side of the street, and they were pretty sure their kid was down there.
Yep. Yeah. And if the parents came out at that point, I remember that too, that if someone's mom or dad was with the kids, then you got 5 or 10 extra minutes.
So the curfews weren't necessarily time-oriented then, it was sort of episodic, street lights, bells.
Yeah.
Well, there was a situation where we had a double driveway, and so we regularly played sports in my front yard, backyard, and using the driveway for hockey and basketball. And I rigged a lighting system, a spot lighting system, and much to the chagrin of a couple of our neighbors on either side of us, we could now stay out till 10 or 11 at night because it was well lit. The concern, I think, was If it's dark and they can't see what you're doing, you're going to get in trouble. But as long as there's a spotlight on you, it's okay.
Yeah, it falls into that category of nothing good happens after midnight. At your respective ages, at that point, nothing good happens after dark. Yeah.
I got to the point where that one became nothing good after 4 a.m. Yeah.
What, leave your neighborhoods just for a second and mentally get around the notion of in the period of years that you were talking about in terms of your schooling. So essentially through high school. We'll leave Elmhurst College out for right now. Favorite memory growing up, not necessarily in the neighborhood.
One of my favorite, close friends, Sue Ernst, we used to hang out at her house a lot in high school. And we were convinced, our group was convinced, that they needed a pool. And so what we decided to do, our little group of friends one night, is we were going to help encourage her parents to make that decision. So in my basement, we got a white sheet and we wrote on it, "Pool under construction" in black magic marker. And we got a cardboard box and lined it with plastic and dug a hole in their front yard, put this box in the front yard, filled it with water, and put up this sign on a sheet that said "Pool under construction." And we thought that, that would do it. That would convince them that they would want to have a pool in their backyard. It didn't quite have the desired effect, but we did learn a very valuable lesson, is that magic marker bleeds through sheets. And even with all the floods that have happened in our basement, you can still see "Pool under construction" written in permanent black magic marker in our basement today.
And you probably learned something about, you take the dirt out of the hole, it never quite fills the hole back up again when you put it back.
Yeah, there was a little extra dirt left over after all that. So. Yeah.
I definitely remember the big snow, and that would have been 67.
Yep.
And even though we were a pretty inclusive neighborhood, all the dads were home from work, and the kids were all home, out. The moms were inside cooking and baking. We were building huge snowmen, huge snow forts, tunnels, a toboggan slide, and it was just incredibly fun. And it probably lasted 3 days, but it seemed like it lasted the whole winter, and we just played the whole time. We were relatively close to 290, and where 290 crossed the railroad tracks, there was a hill, and this hill was just perfect for tobogganing. So we walked down there, toboggan sled for hours, and when we were at the top of it, we were actually just sitting on the side of the expressway. And everything was fine because we were going down the hill, and nobody got hurt and nobody worried about us, and it was just a lot of no worry fun.
Well, I lost my front teeth playing hockey in that storm because our double driveway iced over. We put on hockey skates and we played hockey, and I stuck my blade and went down face first and chopped off my teeth, and forever sent my dentist to great vacations for the next 20 years. But a related, ice skating in Wilder Park.
Mm-hmm.
There hasn't been outdoor ice skating in Elmhurst for many years, simply because the weather doesn't allow it.
Right.
Back when we were kids, when winter came in early November, snow was on the ground, and it probably stayed on the ground until spring came.
Mm-hmm.
And now, it can be 75 degrees 2 days after a 12-inch snowfall.
Yeah.
And so Wilder Park was the place to go to ice skate.
Yeah.
And all kinds of families would get out there with all kinds of, there'd be special skating. The kids who wanted to play hockey would have an area where they could play with their hockey sticks and things like that. And that's something I miss, and I think kids miss out on that opportunity.
Yeah. That's also the same period of time when walking to school was uphill both ways. And
In the snow.
In the snow, right.
It certainly was.
Exactly right. What, The neighborhoods aren't the same today. That doesn't make the old better or the new bad, but they aren't the same today. Why do you think that is? I mean, there's all sorts of reasons, I know, but what are some of those reasons?
A lot of it is organized activities for the kids, because you're not, quote unquote, forced to play with the kids that live next door or across the street. In general, most of the moms were home when I was a kid.
Sure.
My mom worked, and she was one of the very few professional women. A lot of families only had one car, and that car went with dad to work. Those are some
Sure.
of the quick, easy reasons.
Sure.
I think technology. Kids can entertain themselves, or they can interact with people all around the world without having to leave their bedroom. And so in that regard, you know, if I wanted something to do when I was a kid, unless I was ready to go to the basement and play with my army soldiers or my trains or my planes, I had to go out and do something, whatever that may be. You know, kick the can, ring doorbells, whatever the case may be. But you had to go outdoors to do it. And now kids can be self-contained entertainment units.
I think that has a lot to do with it too, is that you had to go to meet someone in order to do something. If you didn't want to play by yourself, you had to physically go there to do it. Where now you can connect electronically, and they may still be playing with their friends or interacting with their friends, but it's not a physical out on the street corner type of thing or on somebody's porch like we used to do.
Well, and I guess too, in fairness, the culture is in the one sense, it's a global culture that we all live in. In another sense, it's a much more privatized culture. Somebody mentioned fences earlier between backyards, and that's not necessarily everywhere, but more fences, more you come into your home and you stay in your home and you don't necessarily venture out unless you've got someplace you need to go, someplace you need to be. What about imagination? Creativity and imagination it sounds to me like it was a necessary part of growing up in your neighborhoods.
Yeah, if you weren't prepared to entertain yourself, don't look at your parents to do it for you. And as Mary Ann said earlier, while you had kids in your age group, it was not uncommon that you also hung around with older kids, and you had younger kids hanging around with you. So there was that multi-age interaction that tends not to happen now.
Right.
Because if you're a 7th grader, you're hanging around with 7th graders, and you're doing your video games with 7th graders, and you're doing your online chats with 7th graders.
And your sports with 7th graders.
And so you're not getting an idea of what your life may be 2 years from now or 3 years from now, because you're seeing it in Buzzy or Greg or Tom.
Yeah, and John mentioned Halloween, and a lot of the schools had carnivals, and John had a carnival, and it was not uncommon for you to go to the Halloween carnival and then say, oh, we could do that. So somebody would turn their garage or their basement into a haunted house or some sort of fun fair for weeks, and it would keep us busy creating stuff, and then the kids would come and you'd probably make a quarter for all your week efforts, and then somebody else would say, oh, we could do better than them, and then the whatever the event was would be in somebody else's garage or basement for weeks.
And I think like what John was saying, as you're playing with kids that are older than you and younger than you, you kind of feel that progression as you go up. You may start out as the kid that gets picked last for the team because you're the youngest and the smallest kid. But then all of a sudden, somebody else's little brother or little sister comes along, and now you're no longer the last one picked. And then a few more years down the road, you're the one that's the captain of the team, and you're picking. And so I think working your way through that progression, you kind of got to see, what it was like all the way up. And I think that was a helpful learning experience for us kids. and helped us, I think, as you get a little bit older.
We all have heard the comments and, if you will, the stories of multi-generational families in Elmhurst, or even more classically, your kids grow up and they initially live somewhere else, but they quote unquote they want to move back to Elmhurst, and many of them do. That is, the ones that never left. Why do you think that is? And this is going to be the last question before we're unfortunately done. But why do you think that is? Why are there multi-generational families in Elmhurst and this desire to come back here?
I think it's a comfortability and a familiarity. I can tell you that when my class graduated from Immaculate Conception High School and kids were off to college, I heard classmates go, "I'm never coming back to this town again." And I can tell you, I've got more than a half dozen who run businesses in town and have raised their kids here, and their kids have now graduated from IC Catholic prep now.
Right.
So it's come full circle for them.
Yeah,
Mary
and
Ann?
I agree with John. It's a lot of it is the familiarity, and I remember never wanting to come back to Elmhurst when I finished high school or to visit my parents. That was enough. But I was not planning to raise my kids here. And lo and behold, things change, and I was very happy to send all my kids through District 205 schools.
I think it's a good town. And until, for those of us that may have been away for a little while and then came back, you don't realize how much Elmhurst had to offer until you leave. And then you look back and it's like, well, gee, they've got good schools, got good parks. You're right close to Chicago, so you've got the cultural events, happening down in the city. You just don't find that mix. You have the neighborhoods. You've got a thriving business district, couple thriving business districts, in town, and you just don't find that in a lot of areas. And I think once people have experienced out of Elmhurst, they see how good it actually is here in town, and they do come back and are happy to be back.
Well, I think your neighborhoods did a good job with all three of you, and your stories are absolutely wonderful, and I'm delighted you could be with me today and share them, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
We've been talking with John Quigley, Mary Ann Gorski, and Scott Algram about growing up in Elmhurst, and I hope you've enjoyed it. It's December as you're seeing this program, so on behalf of the Elmhurst Heritage Foundation, Elmhurst Our Kind of Town, and the Elmhurst Historical Museum, happy holidays to all. I'm Ken Bartels, and we'll see you again.
Hi, I'm John Quigley, President and CEO of the Elmhurst Chamber of Commerce and Industry. In these challenging economic times, it's imperative that our residents and businesses band together to not only shop Elmhurst, but buy Elmhurst whenever possible. We have great stores in our city center, Spring Road, Butterfield Road, York and Villette Streets, St. Charles and Route 83, North Avenue and Lake Street, along North York and even Grand Avenue. I ask for your help. Let's keep our tax dollars in Elmhurst.